We are in Daniel, in chapter 5 is where we're going to be entering into in just a moment. Be turning over there to that chapter. And if you have not gotten word yet, the debate is not going to happen. It's been canceled, and I wasn't the one who canceled it. It was the opponent who canceled it, Brian Dunaway, for financial reasons. He has now come out publicly and said it, so I can say it. It's financial reasons on his part, not being able to make the trip down here. And he says after the first of the year he might be able to. Well, it's not going to happen down here now. If there will be a debate, it would be up there, but I'm doubtful that it will happen even up there. So at any rate, if you're on Facebook, go to my Facebook page and you can read the post concerning it, and I think it's the best thing that it didn't take place. Anyway, Daniel 5, and you can talk to me afterward for more details about that. Daniel chapter 5 is where we are, and you remember that Belshazzar is mentioned here. But we have been talking before this concerning Belshazzar's reign on Daniel, the chapters we were in before. It was the first year of Belshazzar and then the third year of Belshazzar. And now we're in the last year of Belshazzar. As we pointed out, Daniel does not go in chronological order, the way the book is organized. We are going in chronological order. And so we come to Daniel 5:1, and it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Now, Rex Turner in his commentary goes into great detail right at this point about Belshazzar, whether he actually existed and where he fits in the lineage of the Babylonian kings. And I think he makes a very strong case for the fact that Belshazzar did indeed exist, that he likely would be the same individual, if I can quote him correctly, as Neriglissar. In other words, there have been some historians who have suggested that Neriglissar and Belshazzar are the same person, and that is a possibility. But he then talks about the time length of his reign, and he quotes several commentators and historians concerning that discrepancy. And so he just says that there was a king, Belshazzar, who did provide an impious feast. That's described here in Daniel chapter 5. He was a king, as Brother Turner points out. He was a co-regent with his father, King Nabonidus, who had married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar was a son, quote unquote, grandson. It says son in the text, but it would technically be a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, you turn over to Jeremiah chapter 27. And in Jeremiah 27 verse 7, it reads, All the nations shall serve him, that is Nebuchadnezzar, and his son, which would be evil Merodach or Amel Marduk, and his son's son, who would be Belshazzar, until the time of his own land come, and then many nations and great kings shall make him their bondman. So then Brother Turner cites, there really can be no doubt. Belshazzar was a co-regent king with his father Nabonidus, who had married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. So Belshazzar was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. In short, he says, the nations would serve Nebuchadnezzar, his son, evil Merodach, and his son's son, who would be Belshazzar, that we read about. Now, there are those historians and those scholars who take great issue with the fact that Belshazzar ever existed. And there are mainly moderate to liberal scholars that do that. But we have no doubt, and there's no doubt in my mind at least, that not only did Belshazzar exist, but he was a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And if you look at it from that perspective, as we're going to see in the text, certain things come to light that you wouldn't normally see in just reading through the text. So, we see here that he had made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Means they were having a drunken party, is really what it amounts to. It brings to mind what would happen later when you read the book of Esther, when the king in chapter 1 has a big feast with all of the people of his kingdom present, and he tries to parade his wife Vashti before them, and she refused. Remember that? Well, it's sort of similar to this. But notice something else, verse 2. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Now that's a detail that we haven't seen before. Not only was this a drunken party, but it was also using all of the vessels, the gold and silver vessels, that had been in the temple in Jerusalem. And his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar was the one that had taken them out. Now, going all the way back to 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had laid siege to Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and then taken away people into captivity, the last carrying away to Babylon, in fact. And among those were Daniel and his 3 friends. All the way back in chapter 1, we find as the young men that they were, about 18 to 21 years of age, they had been taken to Babylonian captivity. Well, in the midst of all that, Nebuchadnezzar took out all of the vessels out of the temple before he destroyed the temple. Well, now fast forward a bit. We have seen that this same Nebuchadnezzar was given an animal's heart. And you remember, or that is a spirit of an animal, where he was grazing grass just like an animal and could not speak and could not reason. And then his reason came back to him when he acknowledged the one true God. We also know that evil Merodach, his son, Marduk, Nebuchadnezzar's son, freed King Jehoiachin from captivity. Remember that? He freed Jehoiachin out of prison where he had been. Well, Nebuchadnezzar has already gone from the scene. He had turned to worship of the one true God. His son then, in turn, frees Jehoiachin. But the strange thing about it is, evil Merodach, only reigned for about 2 to 3 years. And then he was killed. He was put to death by a conspiracy among his own people. Brother Turner, I think, rightly speculates that the reason that evil Merodach was put to death was because the people that were conspiring against him did not appreciate the fact that Nebuchadnezzar had turned to worship of the one true God, and it was insult to injury that his son releases the king Jehoiachin from prison. I think there's something to be said for that. And so Belshazzar had to have been involved in it. The grandson by that point. He had to have at least given his approval to it. That would then explain, possibly, why they're doing this in verse 2. Part of the reason, at least. They're wanting to make a big show of the fact that they are rubbing this in the face of those that had come out of Israel and come out of Judah. But at any rate, this was a drunken party. And it speaks volumes about the character or lack of it of Belshazzar. Verse 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. This is from the most holy place, by the way. And the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. And I quote Brother Turner on this point. He says this was stupid. And it was. This was absolutely stupid for Belshazzar and the group that was around him to do this. Flaunting all of this in the face of Jehovah. Verse 5, watch this. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now that is an amazing thing to think about. You're sitting there without a care in the world, and all of a sudden you look over here at the wall and you see a giant hand, and it's starting to write on the wall. Would that get your attention? You better believe it would. It'd get my attention quick. You know, you see movies these days that have special effects, and CGI does a tremendous job in showing grand and glorious things on screen. This ain't CGI. Excuse the incorrect grammar. This isn't something that you can just make up. This is a hand that's writing on the wall. Verse 6. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against one another. Yeah, that's a natural reaction, especially if you're half lit. At this point, he was half lit because of all the alcohol he'd been drinking. And he sees this that is taking place on the wall. He just lost control of himself. Have you ever seen somebody that was so scared that they just started shaking all over? Well, that's the way Belshazzar was. Belshazzar's knees were knocking. You know, it's like, what is this? What am I seeing here? The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers or enchanters, the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, just like his grandfather, just like Nebuchadnezzar had done, bring in all the wise men. And so the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet or purple, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, why did he say the third ruler in the kingdom? Well, if Nabonidus was co-regent with Belshazzar, you got Nabonidus in the first place, Belshazzar's in second place. Whoever interprets it correctly will be in the third position. That's the reason why he said he would be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. They're completely impotent, have no power whatsoever to decipher it. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished or perplexed. He is helpless, completely helpless. Here is the co-regent of the kingdom of Babylon. He has all this power at his disposal, and he cannot interpret that writing that is on that wall. He is completely helpless. Verse 10, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Now, who was this queen? This was not the wife of Belshazzar. This was the wife of Nebuchadnezzar. This was the queen mother. Do you remember the queen mother of England that lived for so many years and then finally passed away? Well, this queen mother is in a very similar position. If you look at the queen mother in the Old Testament, you'll find that is a fascinating subject to study. Jimmy G has done a tremendous job in studying through that, about the queen mother in the Old Testament. She was in a position of power. That is, she had the ear of the king normally, and she could influence him for either good or ill. Well, here you've got the queen mother, Nebuchadnezzar's wife, and she's saying, don't be distressed about this. This is in the banquet house or the king's palace. And so, verse 11, there is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, she's talking about Daniel. She's talking about Daniel, no doubt. And she remembers what Daniel had done in the days of Nebuchadnezzar. She keeps on calling Nebuchadnezzar your father, your father. I say your father. Don't let that confuse you. Most likely, Nebuchadnezzar had adopted Belshazzar, not just as his grandson, but also adopted him as his son. That's a possibility at least. Or it could be that Nabonidus had also done this. But at any rate, he was a direct descendant, Belshazzar was, of Nebuchadnezzar. And she's telling him about Daniel that can do this. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. Now the question is, did this queen mother become a believer in the one true God like Nebuchadnezzar? My hunch is that she did not, just because of what is said here. She makes no acknowledgement of God. There's no acknowledgement of Jehovah. So likely, even though Nebuchadnezzar became a believer, she likely didn't. But at any rate, she remembered Daniel, what Daniel did for Nebuchadnezzar. Then was Daniel brought in before the king. Now, let's pause right here and think about this. At this point in Daniel's life, by most estimates, he is between 71 and 78 years old. It's been a long time since he came out of Israel. He was brought out of Judah, that is, all the way to Babylon when he was about maybe 18 to 21 years of age. So depending on his age, he is now between 71 and 78. He's had a long life in Babylon. He has served well the kings that were there, or the king, Nebuchadnezzar, that is. And now he's in semi-retirement, it seems. He has seen the visions that we indicated during the first and the third years of the reign of Belshazzar. But yet, he's not in the position that he was under Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? You think about this. Belshazzar had never seen Daniel before. The grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and this Daniel was one of the closest, if not the closest advisor to his grandfather, and yet Belshazzar had never met him. Never. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers or enchanters, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof. But they could not show the interpretation of the thing. Whereas before he had been scoffing at God and scoffing at all of the temple treasures that they were using in their drunken party, now all of a sudden he is so respectful. Now all of a sudden he wants Daniel to come in here and take care of this matter for him. That's the lack of character in the man Nebuchadnezzar. And so, verse 16, And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. He repeats his promise. You'll be number 3 behind my father Nabonidus and me. You'll be in the third position. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. I love this. Daniel, even at this advanced age, has still got that same spirit that he had when he first came to Babylon. I don't want it. He says, I don't want this. Yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. God gave it to Nebuchadnezzar. Why did God give it to Nebuchadnezzar? God gave it to Nebuchadnezzar to punish the Jews because they had been worshiping idol gods and had been departing from the law of God for so many years and refusing to come back. And so Nebuchadnezzar was sent in to finish the job. He was sent in to carry away, and finally, the Israelites to Babylonian captivity. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. He was a tremendous ruler, is what he's trying to drive at. Your father, there was no other like him, is what he's telling him. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride. He was deposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beasts, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over it whomsoever he will. He's recounting to Belshazzar what had happened to his grandfather. And now, here's the kicker. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. What a charge. You have not humbled your heart, and you knew all this. I can just see Daniel pointing his finger at Belshazzar. You knew all this. You haven't humbled your heart. What a charge. He was part, that is Belshazzar, was part of those who had killed Amon-Marduk. He was part of those who had deposed Amon-Marduk from the throne and had then put in Nabonidus. So Belshazzar wasn't ignorant about all this. Belshazzar knew about all this. But, verse 23, hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. The very God who gave life to you, you are not glorifying, and you're giving glory to all of these dumb idols. That is the ultimate in human pride, the ultimate in human arrogance. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Ooh, you think about that. God has numbered your kingdom and has, past tense, notice this, past tense, has finished it. It's not that it might happen. It's happened. All that's got to happen is just for the coup de grace to be brought. And at this point, the Persian forces were already gathering around Babylon. Whether or not the Babylonians knew it, they might and may not have been even aware that the Persians were at that very moment poised to attack, to drive their final attack into the capital city of Babylon. Or it could be the Persians came by pretense. They might have said that they were lauding Belshazzar and participating in this feast, and then they are just waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Whatever the reason, the Persians were there ready to finish the job. And so he says, God has numbered your kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. That would make a good sermon. And it has in the past. Weighed in the balances and found wanting. That's a sobering thought to think about. When we are weighed in the balances of God, how would we stand? None of us deserve salvation. None of us earn it. Don't get me wrong. But in God's judgment, how do we stand? In the judgment of God, Belshazzar was found wanting. You are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Belshazzar would know exactly what he's talking about here. The Medes and Persians had already been causing trouble. And as far as Belshazzar knew, they were a threat. But if they had come in pretense to help him, quote, celebrate, unquote, then what Daniel would say here would be even more of a dagger in the heart. It's been given to the Medes and Persians. This is about October of 539 BC when this was taking place. We know this because of historians' accounts, contemporary historians, and when the Persians actually took control of Babylon. So this is October of 539. Then commanded Belshazzar, verse 29, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet or purple, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, why did Daniel not refuse this? He had already said, I don't want it. Well, why did he not refuse it here? Well, to refuse would be an act of defiance, number one. Unwarranted defiance. And number two, it wouldn't matter anyway. Daniel's already told him what's going to happen. Your kingdom's been taken away. It's been given the Medes and Persians. So whatever you do right now, it's not going to matter in the next little while. Within just hours, in fact, of this taking place. Because verse 30 says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. In that night. So Cyrus and the Persians come in, and they kill Belshazzar, which marks the end of the Babylonian Empire. And Darius the Mede took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. 62 years old, Darius the Mede comes in. Now, Brother Turner goes into great detail, as well as Brother Haley, talking about who this Darius was. We see another Darius mentioned in the book of Daniel. That's not the same Darius that's mentioned here. Darius the Mede, as described here in verse 31, is likely a man named Ugbaru, who was the governor of Gaudium, who under Lysias the Persian entered Babylon on October 12, 539. He entered into Babylon, took control, and killed Belshazzar. This Darius the Mede is not the same as the Darius that we're going to be seeing later on in our study. But at any rate, this Darius was killed November 6, 539 BC in battle. He was killed in the midst of a battle. And because of him being killed, then there was another who ascended to the throne of Persia. So this Darius is not the same one as we're going to see later on. Chapter 6, in fact, begins, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes or satraps, which should be over the whole kingdom. Now, the reason why we know this is not the same Darius is because of what has been discovered in recent days, or recent years, that is, concerning the different men that are mentioned here in Daniel. Historians have given us clarity about this. This Darius is not the Ugbaru of chapter 5. This Darius is named Gubaru. Now, that's weird names, I know. Ugbaru and Gubaru, but that was their names. This Gubaru was installed by Cyrus on about 538 BC. And so you have here another Darius, who is installed by Cyrus and who sets forth all these satraps. And over these three presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage. So now here we have Daniel several years after the events that have taken place in chapter 5, and he is now in a position of authority yet again in yet another government. He is a man that rises to the top, just like Joseph, wherever he is. And at this point, Daniel was about 84. So we've had a period of time that's elapsed. At this point, he's 84 years old, and yet still going just as strong as he was when he was in his teens and 20s. Then this Daniel was preferred or distinguished above the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. That's no shock. No surprise here. Daniel is that kind of man. He did his job and did it well and did it where he pleased everyone. Daniel was a man that had that it factor. You've heard Hollywood actors and actresses having the it factor, just something about them that draws you to them. That's the way Daniel was. Daniel was like that all of his life. There was something about Daniel that people were just drawn to. And of course, that was the case here. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find none occasion nor fault. For as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Now that is a record that anyone would love to have. Nobody could find anything in his character that would stick. He was a Teflon person, and that was in the very best way. These men that were under Daniel were simply jealous of his position. They were completely jealous that he was in the place where he was. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel, except we find it against him concerning the law of his God. Notice, of his God, as if there was another God. Yet we're going to find about the law of his God. Then these presidents and princes assembled together to the king and said thus unto him, King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, the counselors and the captains have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now that is a complete and total farce. It was an abject lie what they were saying to him, because it was not the case that all the presidents and the governors and so on, because Daniel was not a part of it. Daniel was the man that was over all of them. And yet he was not aware of this. They were doing this behind his back, and they were presenting it to the king as if Daniel was involved in this. So this is pretense. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. That was a very distinguishing feature of the Persian Empire. When they set forth a law, they did not change it. The law of the Medes and Persians changeth not, altereth not. So they knew if the king decreed it, it would stick. And they also knew what Daniel would do. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Darius didn't suspect a thing at this point. He was flattered. He was flattered by this, as they knew he would be. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, notice this. When Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house. And his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he did aforetime. Daniel hears about this decree. He hears about what is said. He didn't have any part of it. Yet he hears about it. He understands it's been signed. He knows the law of the Medes and Persians doesn't change. So what's the first thing he does? He goes into his house, gets in his place before his window toward Jerusalem, kneels and prays, as he always has done before. Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Notice Daniel was not doing this in secret. He had his window open. He didn't care who saw him. And yet these men gather outside of his house because they have obviously been seeing him do this every day. They have really gotten rankled over this. So they know exactly what time to come over there and what time to look. And sure enough, there's Daniel praying just like he has before. Then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Yes, I've done that. Then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah. Notice this little snide remark they always say. This Daniel, who is of the children of the captivity, those people that we conquered, or that the Babylonians conquered. You see the snide way in which they're saying it. regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. Now he realizes that all of this had been a ruse. It had been a farce to set up Daniel. Without thought for his own position, the king tries to figure out a way to nullify this, but he can't. He can't change Medo-Persian law. There's no way he can do this. Then these men assembled unto the king and said unto the king, Know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. In other words, you remember, you can't change it. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. Can you imagine this ordeal for Darius? Darius really liked Daniel, trusted him. And he knows that Daniel is not to blame. And this had to have been a big ordeal for him to give that command to bring out Daniel and to throw him into that lion's den. Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee. Can you hear the emotion in his voice? He wants Daniel to be delivered. And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. He's abiding by Persian law here still. Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments of music brought before him, and his sleep went from him. Darius was a man of character. Even though he was not a worshiper of the one true God, he was a man of moral character. Then the king arose very early in the morning and went in haste unto the den of lions. You see, he's concerned about Daniel. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice, fear, anxiety, all the emotions that were boiling up in him, unto Daniel. And the king spake and said to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God whom thou servest continually able to deliver thee from the lions? Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. Can you imagine that? Darius is expecting to see or to hear the lions growling and tearing flesh, and yet Daniel's voice comes. My God has sent his angel and has shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt. He gives Darius a gentle rebuke. Not much, a gentle rebuke. Reminds him, I'm innocent of this, but God has delivered me. Can you imagine seeing those lions just like little kittens gathered around Daniel? And I can imagine Daniel petting one of those lions. Just standing there, this old man petting one of those lions just sitting there, not doing a thing. Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. Brother Turner points out that Daniel was an Old Testament version of the Apostle Paul. And I agree with that, because Daniel ministered to the Gentiles, just as Paul ministered to the Gentiles in the New Testament. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accursed Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, and their wives. And the lions had the mastery of them, and brake all their bones in pieces. Or ever they came at the bottom of the den. The heathen learned of God from this. And those lions that had been hungry for all this time were now allowed by God to take care of things. And they certainly did. Then King Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. Extensive, this declaration. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. And his kingdom that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth, and he worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius, and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. October 29th, 539 BC to 530 BC, Daniel was about 91 to 92 years old at the end of the reign of Cyrus. Amazing. This old soldier of God, still going strong, still being delivered by his God. Well, next week we're going to skip on over to Daniel chapter 11. Yes, we're going in chronological order, so we're skipping back over to Daniel 11 next week, so make a note of that. And then that's where we will start